Good morning, everybody. So I'm just going to finish off our lesson from yesterday. Uh, so yesterday's lesson was the study and development over time, and we looked at the social development of pretty much the middle classes yesterday. Bit of recapping 1871 to 1914, but mainly focusing in on World War One and the Weimar Republic, taking it up to 1932. What we need to do then to finish off today's lesson is we need to just focus in on the working classes during the same period, but we'll do a little bit of a recap from 1871 to 1914 as well. Okay, so if you just have your mind map ready, and we'll just sort of finish this one off. When I do these videos, I always have to kind of like start at the very first slide, so just bear with me while I now scroll through the slides from yesterday. That's obviously the artisans that we looked at yesterday. So remember the sort of craft workers, pretty much a sort of like in a sense, a shrinking social group, jeopardized by the modern age. And that sort of process certainly accelerated and through World War One and into the Weimar Republic, and very much attracted to the Nazis. That was the new information then about the Mittelstand, the artisans in the 1920s in the Weimar era. Appeal to the Nazi Party. Then we looked at the white collar workers, and the obvious comparison with the artisans is they were a sort of middle class group. Unlike the other comparison is we can now see that they were very much attracted to the Nazi Party and became a sort of core part of Nazi Party membership. So they were, like the artisans, they were very disaffected with the Weimar Republic, with democracy, which didn't seem to be helping them. The difference with the artisans, in a sense, is the white collar workers were an expanding group. Okay, there were more of them. Industrialization, in a sense, accelerated the growth of the white collar workers. They were sort of filled administrative positions in business and in government, educated professionals, and all of those sorts of social groups expand when you have industrialization, because with the growth of towns and cities, industrial towns and cities, you obviously have the growth of the white collar work associated, and particularly in the Weimar Republic, when there was a huge expansion through American methods that were being brought into Germany, that we looked at yesterday, sort of department stores and what we call rationalisation of business, conveyor belt technology, etc., etc. Significantly expanded the number of white collar workers in Weimar Germany, yet they became very disaffected, and a significant proportion were attracted to the Nazi Party. So there's the old information about the white collar workers. The point there about them becoming increasingly powerful before World War One with the growth of industry, and then the impact of World War One, and then their declining status, even though their numbers were increasing as we moved into the Weimar era. Significantly hit by the hyperinflation because of their loss of savings, and then suddenly almost like a double hit 6-7 years later, with the onset of the Great Depression. They were hit again because as businesses closed, they lost their jobs. And the attraction to the Nazi Party. And there's the document that we looked at in yesterday's lesson that looked at, in particular, the artisans there and the white collar workers, and how they were very much attracted to party membership. That's what it was about, party membership. They were and voters as well, but in particular, party membership are those who actually want to give their time in the evenings and weekends to support the Nazi Party, which is, again, very interesting. Okay, so the final strand then, which we'll focus on now, that's just a little bit of a recap, is the urban working classes. And again, I'll move fairly quickly through the recap slides, because we've done all that in previous lessons. Okay, so that's for you to sort of go back and have a look at. You can obviously pause this video and just read the information yourself. But we'll start off with usually in a nutshell that just sort of pulls all this together in one page. So in a nutshell, the urban working classes were the most rapidly growing social group from the 1870s onwards, okay, with industrialisation, obviously. Okay, so they were rapidly growing. Again, the use of vocabulary in A-level history is really important, and I think the pace of change, rapid, is an important word for you to use. They were also increasingly well organised in their campaigns to persuade the middle and upper classes to give them more power. Okay, so they did organise themselves, and the point there is that the working classes, unlike the working classes in the countryside, the working classes in the countryside are in effect peasants, farm labourers. It's more difficult for them to organise in a sense, or historically, because they're more spread out, whereas the working classes are a discontented group with poor living conditions, poor working conditions, who grew very suddenly, but they're very concentrated, close together, because they live in cities. So they talk to each other, and so they became motivated, read pamphlets, in particular Marxist pamphlets, and as a result of that, they organised themselves. Okay, and that was the sort of like main trend that was happening from the 1870s onwards. Now, the way in which they organised themselves were economically in the workplace through trade unions, which we looked at yesterday. Trade unions are a sort of they are theoretically, at least, they're not a political instrument. They're an economic instrument. They are about basically campaign, and a social instrument, because the purpose of trade unions is to negotiate with employers in the workplace for fair pay conditions, working conditions, such as working hours, etc. Okay, and of course they've got the weapon of being able to use the strike. Now, the trade unions in particular developed from the 1880s onwards, and certainly as we move into the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, they became very influential and very powerful. Okay, but also politically, the working class now had an organisation, because they had got their own political party, the SPD, and as we saw, by 1912 that had become the largest party. And then after 1919, of course, another more radical political party formed, the Communist Party, originally the Spartacists, okay, very much inspired by the success of the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution. Now, Bismarck, going back to the 1870s and 1880s, had been frustrated because he had tried to deal with the trade unions and the SPD. So Bismarck was very much sort of frustrated. His inability, we'll look at the detail in a second. You move into the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, of course, after, as we move into the 1890s and 1900s, approaching World War I, the Kaiser had applied a variety of approaches to try to sort of weaken the working class organisations, but ultimately had largely failed. I mean, one of them was Weltpolitik. We'll come back to that in a second. And by 1912, the SPD were the largest party. Okay. Now, when the war broke out, of course, we've already done about Bergfried of the working classes, led by a fairly moderate SPD, that said, we will support the war because we believe that Germany is under attack, that it is a defensive war. But clearly, by 1917 to 1918, they felt that they, in a sense, had been hoodwinked by the government, when they had been told in 1914 that it was a defensive war, because clearly it was now an offensive war and it had gone on far too long without any visible gains. So the working classes very much turned against the war. We've already done that. But what was interesting is that many workers became radicalised, okay? So they began to turn to the more extreme ideology, in particular the ideology of the Bolsheviks from Russia, that actually the pathway to improvement for the living and working conditions of the working class was actually not to push for reform within the existing system, but it was actually to change it from outside. In other words, to revolution, to overthrow the existing system and create government by workers' councils, Soviets. Now, of course, so that's what we're saying. The Communist Party, originally the Socialists, pushed for a complete overthrow of the social pyramid, turning it upside down in effect and putting the working classes in power. But that, of course, that failed. Okay, the Weber-Gruner Pact and the return of the soldiers, it failed, and they failed. They, in a sense, certainly the Communist Party failed in its objectives. Okay, but nevertheless, with the election of a Constituent Assembly and the creation of the Weimar Republic, the working classes undoubtedly were much more powerful in the 1920s in the Weimar Republic than they had been in the Second Reich, because for obvious reasons Germany became much more democratic, therefore it strengthened their vote, and of course their political party, the SPD, continued throughout the 1920s to be the largest party in the Weimar Republic. Okay, they never achieved a majority, but certainly in the early years, until the mid-1920s, they dominated the government. The first president of the Weimar Republic, Weber, was a socialist from the SPD. And so the Weimar Republic undoubtedly supported the objectives of the working classes. So the trade unions became much more influential in fighting for workers' rights. The onset of that's one example. Okay, so politically, their vote was strengthened. Women had the vote, so working class women. We'll look at that next lesson. But working class women obviously now had a voice, and the trade unions were more influential. And of course, remember, basic civil liberties were guaranteed and written into the Constitution. So there was improvement, and of course, in the mid-1920s, there was economic growth. Or at least a kind of recovery of the economy, and that obviously improved pay conditions, etc., to some extent, and we'll look at that. Okay, but then of course the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, hugely important. Okay, so Wall Street crash, all that American money was pulled out of Germany, and effectively the German economy crashed. And remember, the main symptom, the main problem that resulted was massive unemployment, okay, bankrupt businesses closing down, and of course therefore huge numbers of working class Germans lost their jobs, okay, reaching 6 million by 1932. So the working classes, who had never really been bought into the Weimar Republic fully, now in effect became further disenchanted with the Weimar Republic. Now, in contrast to the artisans and the white-collar workers, who, when they became disenchanted, their vote tended to go to the right wing, okay, of politics. In other words, the Nazi Party, the far right, or the German Conservative, the German Nationalist Party. The working class vote, on the whole, went more to the left wing. Okay, so there was, in other words, a significant increase in support for, in particular, the Communist Party. Okay, but also for the SPD. But now, one of the key features that is so crucial, you make sure you think about this, because we'll revisit it time and time again, is there were two parties on the political left for the working classes to support. There was the SPD, which was the more moderate working class party, a reformist party. In other words, the SPD did want to bring about change that would benefit the working classes, improve their working conditions and their living conditions, but the SPD wanted to do it within the existing system. Okay, the SPD felt it was that they shouldn't deny the middle classes a say in the running of Germany. Everybody should have an equal say. Whereas the Communist Party, in effect, did not want to give the middle classes a say. The Communist Party wanted to overthrow the existing system. So an increasing number of working classes were attracted to the KPD from 1929 onwards. As we move into the early 1930s, we see a big increase in the vote for the KPD. Okay, and the KPD, the communists, were obviously revolutionary. They wanted to overthrow the system. Okay, and that division, okay, that the fact that the working class vote was split between two parties, in effect, weakened the influence of those two parties. This is the key point. If the Communist Party and the SPD had worked together and voted together, for example, in the Reichstag, then with hindsight, we could see that Hitler and the Nazi Party, who got a huge amount of support on the far right, would have found it much, much more difficult, if not impossible, to achieve power, which of course happened in January 1933. The Nazis took power. But unfortunately, the SPD and the KPD, rather than, because they're both Marxist parties, they're both socialist parties, rather than work together to support the working classes and to prevent the rise of Hitler, unfortunately, the SPD and the KPD focused more on their own internal disagreements, because they were both Marxist parties, but the SPD wanted a reformist pathway to support the workers, and the KPD wanted a revolutionary pathway to support the workers. And so there's that sort of like key point. If the working classes had been united, in other words, there had only been one political party to represent them, then arguably they could have presented the rise of Nazism on the far right. And we'll develop that more in the next 3 or 4 lessons, but it is a crucial point. Okay, so these are the detailed slides, and as I say, I'm not going to read through point by point. Here's the recap of the old information. So this is about the growth of the SPD. Remember, in the 1870s through until World War One, there was only one political party that represented the working classes, really, and that was the SPD, the Social Democrats. Okay, so we looked at urbanisation, industrial growth, and then we looked at the growth of the Social Democratic Party and how the trade union movement flourished. And the Social Democratic Party was in effect formed in 1875 and steadily grew, reaching 1912 when they became the largest party in the Reichstag. Okay, and actually by 1912 the largest and most influential, best organised socialist party in the world. Their aims and methods, remember, the Social Democrats were a Marxist party. They followed the teachings of the philosopher Karl Marx. So again, I won't go into all that sort of issue, but the detail of that. But generally, the belief of Karl Marx was that workers would develop a revolutionary consciousness, and it would eventually erupt into revolution. But despite being inspired by Karl Marx, the SPD was not a revolutionary party. They argued that legal democratic processes needed to be followed to support the workers. So their key aim was reformist. It was to push to change the constitution, giving the workers greater representation. Now, in the Kaiserreich, in the before World War One, in particular with Bismarck, as with most of his social class and the elites, were extremely uncomfortable about the growth. They needed the workers because the workers kept industry moving, and they needed industry to make weapons, etc., and to modernise the country. But at the same time, they didn't want the working classes to be organised and pushing for power for themselves. political and economic. So Bismarck, remember, attempted to undermine the Social Democratic Party, and in particular 1878, remember, he passed the anti-socialist laws, but remember he changed his strategy in the 1880s, trying to kill socialism by, in a sense, by being kind to the workers, by giving them a little bit of what they wanted, sort of a welfare system, free medical treatment, accident insurance, and so on and so forth. Okay, a pension scheme. Now you do need to know those. That's really important that you learn those off by heart. But ultimately, did it work? No. The workers continued to support the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats, as you know, continued to grow. Just being kind to the workers didn't sort of like win them over to the German Conservative Party. So ultimately Bismarck failed, and we looked at that, and sort of how he didn't address the whole problem, in particular the issue about working hours and child labour, etc., etc. So those are areas that we looked at. Okay, now then Bismarck, who was primarily the Chancellor of Kaiser Wilhelm I. There's a bit of an overlap. 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm I died, and then Kaiser Wilhelm II took over the throne in 1888. Didn't last long. Bismarck resigned in 1890. We then move into a series of chancellors who were the chancellors for Kaiser Wilhelm II. And as we know, Kaiser Wilhelm II sort of like was much more dominant, more involved in politics. But you do need to know the sort of policies of the different chancellors. So Caprivi, in a sense, continued Bismarck's policy of trying to kill socialism with kindness. We've covered that. And then the subsequent chancellors, particularly Bülow, he's the important one. Remember, they followed what I called a sort of three-prong approach. Three things, okay? They partly continued the policy of trying to win them over with kindness by giving them welfare measures. Generally didn't work. The other one was the alliance of steel and rye. Politically, the Junkers sort of working closely with the industrial elites to sort of like repress the influence of the SPD and the Reichstag. Generally didn't work. Okay, and then the other one, which is the interesting one, remember Chancellor Bülow followed that policy of Weltpolitik, turning Germany into a global colonial power to try to sort of like create national pride amongst the working classes in the achievement of their country, to, in a sense, distract them away from socialism towards nationalism. So we did a lesson on that. And again, that's an important sort of concept, and particularly Kaiser Wilhelm II, because he loved naval building, etc., and he was a passionate supporter of Weltpolitik. But again, all of those policies ultimately didn't really work, and the proof was in the pudding in the 1912 elections when the SPD won 110 seats. Okay, but nevertheless, when the war broke out in 1914, remember Bergfriede, all the social classes on the whole rallied behind the war, okay, and the SPD called upon the working classes to support the war, and generally speaking, they did, okay, but by the middle years of the war, the mood began to turn against the war for all the reasons that we've explored, the impact of the British blockade, the struggling home front, the food shortages, the turnip winter, and then of course working classes who've been conscripted into the army out on the fighting fronts. Simply the war was not, the military war was not being won. It got bogged down into trench warfare, and that growing sense that the German people had not been told the truth. So mass casualties, and then of course one of the big catalysts was the Russian Revolution of 1917, which kind of inspired working classes to think, well, actually, should we follow the example of the working classes in Russia and just basically turn against the war? Okay, So there was increased, therefore, large-scale political opposition among the working classes. But first, remember, 1917, it was largely economic. They simply wanted the war to end so they could feed their families. But then increasingly, workers went on strike. And of course, they began increasingly to talk about bringing about pushing for political reform or even possibly an end to the Kaiserreich. And so some workers became radicalised, and of course we saw in the German Revolution the radicalised workers supported the socialists, but generally speaking the majority of German workers were not radicalised in that way, and they absolutely pushed for an end to the war. And of course Hebert, their leader, took over in November 1918, and effectively the SPD formed the first government, and Hebert became the first president of the new Weimar Republic after the fall of the Kaiser. So we've covered all of that. Okay, so now in terms of new information, then, so the key things are as follows. Okay, so the new Weimar Constitution, remember, written by Hugo Preuss, August 1919, actually guaranteed, it was written into the Constitution, the 8-hour working day. That's something that no matter all of the concessions that, for example, Bismarck had given to the workers with pensions, etc., medical care, they had never won the 8-hour working day. And that was a huge gain because it was actually guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution. It was written into the Constitution. So that was a big gain. It also guaranteed that employees, any employees, and that included the working class, but it also included white-collar workers, for example, had equal rights in the workplace with employers. So those were big gains. Okay, because Weimar Germany was a democratic system, the most democratic system in the world, in many ways. Okay. The other thing to understand as we move into the 1920s is that sort of growth of the big cities continued. Urbanization that's the key word. It continued during the Weimar era. Okay, so for example, Berlin's population was less than 2 million in 1919. By 1925, it had more than doubled. Okay. That was actually, and it sounds like a huge expansion, but it was actually at a slightly slower rate than before. Okay, so there still is expansion, but it's slightly decelerated. Okay, so for example, the population of Germany's large cities had doubled between 1870 and 1890, then doubled again between 1890 to 1910. Okay, so those were each 20-year periods, but in the 30-year period from 1910 up to 1940, it didn't double, but it grew at a rate of 36%. Okay, if cities double, then it effectively, 36% is only growing by a third. So, but nevertheless, in particular Berlin, the capital, and I've already mentioned that. I mean, Weimar Germany, particularly in the Golden Era, Berlin was a sort of like huge place of interest. Visitors around the world went to Berlin because it was such an exciting, innovative place. There was that sort of feeling in Berlin. Let's just live for the moment. And they'd gone through the war. Germany had become a republic, much more freedom had been introduced. Okay, the first years of the Weimar Republic had been a complete disaster, and many social groups had become quite radicalised. But then things significantly improved, and Berlin was a centre of experimentation in the arts and culture and architecture, and generally a sense of excitement, of liberation. And we'll develop that more. We'll look at that more in our next lesson when we look at women in the Weimar Republic. So that's that. So there's point number 3. Working conditions, on the whole, therefore, did improve during the mid-years of the Weimar Republic, that sort of golden era. Real wages increased by 9%. Real wages basically means what your money will buy for you. Okay, I mean, wages could increase, but if prices go up faster than wages, your real wages have actually declined. Okay, but generally speaking, wages went up slightly more overall than prices. So by 9% in 1927 and by 12%. Now this remember is the middle era, 1924 to 29. Obviously in 1923, workers suffered considerably with the hyperinflation, but then with the new Rentenmark that stabilised the German currency, we begin to see an improvement, okay, in the conditions for the workers. So, for example, there were new house building projects for workers during this period, and very good houses. You know, again, Germany was very innovative. It was these are not sort of like pre-World War One houses. You've got American ideas pouring into Germany. And so the new housing developments in Weimar Germany, I mean, many of them still exist today. The way in which they were designed, with letting with big windows, letting in light, with courtyards and proper sanitation facilities and play areas, etc., were way ahead of other countries in the world. I mean, Britain, for example, in the 1920s was still struggling with really awful Victorian accommodation that had been built during the Industrial Revolution, whereas Weimar Germany was very modern, okay, in the building projects. Again, if you go to the book by Eric Weitz, I'll scan that chapter for you, but there's a really good chapter about architecture and about the Bauhaus movement and about the key architects like Mendelssohn, who designed these department stores and the housing complexes, etc., for the German workers. So undoubtedly there was an improvement in the mid-1920s. Unemployment insurance for those who were out of work. And of course, their party was the largest political party in the Reichstag. Okay. Until 1932, we must not underestimate that. And also the SPD, remember, Germany was still a federal system, so there were separate parliaments for the different states within Germany, and the largest state was Prussia. And throughout the whole of the Weimar Republic, the SPD dominated and controlled Prussia. Okay, so and of course the capital of Prussia was Berlin as well. Okay, so working classes undoubtedly gained, but, and here's the big but, the Wall Street crash of October 1929, which led to the Great Depression, the pulling out of all that American money, had a major impact on the working classes, and the most significant impact was mass unemployment. And the number of working classes who lost their jobs as a result of the Great Depression was absolutely enormous. By 1932, okay, which was just 2.5 years after the Wall Street crash, so an incredibly short period of time, 31% of Germans were unemployed, and the vast majority of those unemployed Germans were working classes. Okay, and that compares to 10% in 1929. So 1 in 10 Germans were unemployed in 1929. By 1932, it was more than 3 in 10. And then by 1933, 6 million Germans were unemployed. And as I said, what basically happened is the working classes, in a sense, they remembered what came back to haunt them then were the difficult times from 10 years before. Okay, so obviously World War One and the German Revolution, and then the early 1920s with the hyperinflation, they were all difficult times for the working classes. Things had improved for 4 or 5 years, and in a sense the working classes had begun to reconcile and buy themselves into the fact that the Republic was working for them. But then suddenly, when it went so badly wrong in 1929, it kind of like made sense. They remembered what had happened 10 years before, and they were a huge disillusionment with the Republic kicked in, and hence many working classes, they turned to vote for the Communist Party, okay, rather than the SPD. They turned for a revolutionary party on the far left, and so they became radicalised against the Republic. Many didn't. Many continued to vote for the SPD. In fact, some German workers were attracted to the Nazi Party. So we look at Nazi Party membership. Yeah, so you've got to be a little bit careful. Before 1930, there were, the figure there, 34,000 German workers belonged to the Nazi Party. It had actually increased to more than 250,000 by January 1933 when Hitler became Chancellor. But let's be careful on that. The working classes, there were millions of them. On the whole, the working class vote went to the other extreme, to the far left. Okay, that's that. Hopefully that was helpful for you to finish it off. It's obviously quite an important area, the urban working classes. And in our lesson tomorrow, we'll finish off this sort of like study of section C, where we're looking at the development of the economy and society over time, bringing everything up to 1932, that key year 1932, which was the final year of the Weimar Republic. So we'll finish that off by looking at the role of women, and then we'll move into depth study 3, which is about the Nazi Party, the rise and how they took power and how they consolidated power in the early 1930s. Thanks very much, everybody. See you in the lesson tomorrow.